Let's talk about history. The history of pendulums in particular is a little bit murky. The history of dowsing, on the other hand, is much more well documented. You have some people claiming it goes back to before recorded human history, citing some rather ambiguous cave paintings as evidence, but you also have it appearing in our earliest records of human history. You have records of people performing dowsing in as far back as Sumer. You have biblical accounts with Moses dowsing for water and famously angrily smiting the ground with his staff and getting himself in some trouble. And you have accounts all the way to modern times where it turns out there are actually British water companies on modern record dowsing to find leaks in their pipes. And they charge people for this, and it turns out they have found that it works better than not doing it that way. So pendulums come into it significantly later. Like, our first recorded records are 7,000 years past the point of our first recorded records of dowsing later. The first date that I can find specifically associated with pendulums is 1271 AD in the works of one Marco Polo, known for exploration as well as water sports, who documented that there were individuals in China who made use of pendulums. It was not specifically to find water or for any other purpose. It was somewhat vague, but that there were people in China who were using these as part of their religious or spiritual or divinatory practice. You then fast forward dramatically to find actual verifiable documented uses of pendulums, and you look in the Catholic Church. In particular, you get one Abbe Mermet, who was a Catholic priest in the late 19th, early 20th century, who was very well known as a dowser and diviner who made use of a pendulum to find everything from missing people to lost treasures of the church, for the Vatican and also for individuals. He was considered sort of one of the founders of what later got termed, a couple of decades later, radiathesia, which is a fun compound word, basically combining thesia for sensing of radiant energy. So the idea being that you are somehow sensing the energy that emanates off of people or treasure or maps or water or whatever, that you're somehow picking up on that energy. The term was coined for the curious by a different French priest, one Alexis Timothea Boully, and I'm horribly mispronouncing that because I don't speak French, B-O-U-L-Y, if anyone wants to correct me on that. There's actually a certain level of debate as to whether divination via pendulum should really be considered dowsing at all. The Association of American Dowsers, I believe it's called, has actually had very polite but documented arguments over whether dowsing should really just be finding water with a stick of one of two traditional shapes, or the use of any kind of tool to search for any kind of thing. And as of yet, I don't believe they've settled the question. Another case where the use of pendulums for sort of divinatory purpose enters the modern historical record is with Albert Abrams, also known as the founder of radionics. And he was of the firm belief that you could use a pendulum in order to divine where something was wrong with the body. So he used pendulums for determining illness and possible treatment. This is particularly interesting in his case because just a couple of years before he started promoting this doctrine, he was a well-known, well-respected, well-regarded neurologist who then began promoting this idea and became very wealthy off of sort of the machines associated with radionics, and then was sent a blood sample which he famously concluded had a number of illnesses, including malaria, and it turned out came from a rooster rather than a human. This pretty much put the nail in the coffin for his methodology with regards to the scientific community. Pendulums are in fairly common use in modern spiritual and occult practices as essentially a divinatory tool, and not infrequently as a healing tool. I know that many modern Reiki practitioners specifically make use of the pendulum. My personal experience with Reiki does not go far back enough in its lineage to know for sure when that came into the system, but I know that it's in common usage now. Construction of the pendulum. First, let's talk materials. I used copper for the majority of this because copper is a very good conductor of energy. And if the point is to employ one's radiesthesia in order to sense energy, having something that conducts it well is going to be very useful. Second, hematite. Hematite is in there basically because it's one of the gemstones that can actually be magnetized. And with the idea of being able to point to a specific target, something that can be magnetized seemed very appropriate to me. The pearl is, one, conveniently shaped in order to provide a point to aim at something specific on a mat or a map. But two, the oldest documented record we have of the use of pendulums is from China. And in China, black pearls are believed to come from the head of a dragon, and they are believed to be symbolic of wisdom and knowledge because of this. And so it seemed like an appropriate thing to put at the tip of a divinatory tool. Methods of construction. I actually used 3 different types of chain weave in this piece. The first is just a very simple connected chain of links. This is both to add some additional length, and it moves very well in exactly 2 directions, side to side, front to back. Those are the sort of the degrees of freedom associated with that. The second is called Byzantine chainmail, or Byzantine chain weave, and is a round weave, which means that it adds additional degrees of freedom to the movement of the pendulum. So it adds more easy degrees of freedom to the movement. Byzantine chain is the most common name for this weave, but no one actually knows why. The origins are kind of lost to time. Now we have records of it going back to, the 6th century AD, so it's entirely possible that it was created in Byzantium. It's also been known by a variety of other names, including birdcage, fool's dilemma, idiot's trap, idiot's delight, bird's nest, and king's chain. So there's a whole bunch of different names for this. It's very old, it's kind of a classic, and it looks really cool. The third one was basically by necessity. I had to do a trapped bead chain style in order to put the beads in. The other option would potentially have been to hang them like I hung the pearl, using them as beads, but I feel like putting them in the center of the chain links them more directly into the whole piece for the purposes of sort of energetic use. Also, on a more prosaic level, having them through the center means that the entire thing is balanced, and when you're using your pendulum, it's not going to have a tendency to flare off to one side because you've got 3 beads hanging off of it at irregular intervals. The pearl I attached using something called a head pin, which is basically a very thin piece of wire that goes through a hole and has a little bit bigger flat end at one side that makes it stop going through. And then you take the remaining piece and roll it down to provide a circle that you can attach. So, the use of pendulums for divinatory purposes. In modern practice, there's a few ways that this is typically done. The first and probably simplest is to answer basic questions. For this, you hold the pendulum steady in your hand, and you say, okay, what does a yes answer look like? And wait for the pendulum to start to move in a pattern. And then you still the pendulum and you still your hand and you say, okay, what does a no answer look like? And you wait for the pendulum to form a different pattern. And then you ask yes or no questions and get answers. For some people, the movements of the pendulum are very large and pronounced. For some people, they're very small and subtle. And for some people, such as myself, it varies depending on sort of the intensity of the yes or the no. Think one of those irritating work surveys. Somewhat agree, strongly agree, very strongly agree. Will dictate sort of how large the motion is. Some people always have the same things for a yes or a no answer. For example, spinning counterclockwise for a no, spinning clockwise for a yes. Some people will use a pendulum with a mat or with a grid of some kind where there are a preset number of answers or patterns or ideas that it can point to. So you can ask slightly more complicated questions that have conceptual answers beyond just a simple yes or no. The other primary means of using a pendulum for divination is, well, dowsing. You're looking for something, you're looking for someone, you're looking for whatever. This can either be done in the physical presence of where you're looking for something. The classic example, of course, being looking for water for a well, where you'll walk around the area until you get the reaction to show this is the place. You can also use a representation of the area that you're trying to search, often a map. People will take a pendulum over a map and move it around until they feel it react in some way. The way that it reacts seems to vary greatly based on the individual. These are sort of the two primary divinatory means of using a pendulum that are in common use. I'm not really going to talk about healing modalities, I think.
Did you talk about Reiki? Yes, that was in the history.
I mentioned it in the history. So one other thing to note here is that I've talked before about how divinatory systems take essentially some element of randomness, whether it's the shuffling of a pack of cards, the drawing of a pack of runes. I've known people who use Scrabble tiles, whatever, and give it the opportunity to intersect with the patterns of what's happening in reality, or give it the opportunity for spirits to nudge the random chance and deliver a message, however you prefer to conceptualize it. In the case of a pendulum, the randomness is in the motion of the pendulum and is actually being generated by a combination of external factors like the wind and muscle tremors. So it's a very good system for talking to yourself in particular, where you are trying to divine answers to questions that you already on some level have. It gives a great means for your subconscious to communicate with your conscious, essentially. Thank you all for joining us. Please remember to like, subscribe. If you enjoyed this in particular and would like more like it, or for that matter, if you hated this and would never like to see anything like it again, please let us know in the comments below. We appreciate your feedback. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you next time. Is to be able to apply one's radiothesia? Blah, blah, blah. Thank you all for joining us. Please remember to like, subscribe, and if you enjoyed this in particular or would like more content like this, please let us know in the contents below. Cut.